On paper, the sentence sounds simple. The inmate has arrived. But inside ADX Florence, arrival is not a moment. It is a process designed to erase the outside world. There is no welcoming corridor, no shouting tear, no clanging chaos you see in movies. Instead, there is silence, controlled, engineered, absolute. For the men who enter ADX Florence, the first 90 days are not about serving time. They're about learning how time behaves when almost nothing moves. No one explains what will happen to you psychologically. No handbook tells you how your mind will respond to being alone for 23 hours a day. No warning prepares you for what isolation does when it is not temporary, but structural. The door closes, and it does not slam. It seals. The cell is not small by accident. The light is not positioned randomly. The silence is not empty. It is intentional. From a very first day, ADX Florence begins testing something invisible. How long the human mind can remain intact when stimulation disappears. In the first week, most inmates believe they are coping. They tell themselves this is manageable. They pace. They count steps. They memorize cracks in the concrete. But ADX Florence does not break people quickly. It reshapes them slowly. By the second week, time stops behaving normally. Minutes stretch. Hours lose meaning. Days blur into a single unbroken loop of routine. Meals arrive through a slot. Voices come through walls, but never bodies. Human presence becomes theoretical. There are no casual conversations. No spontaneous contact. No unscripted moments. Every interaction is regulated. Every movement is monitored. Every sound is deliberate. And somewhere between day 14 and day 30, something subtle begins to happen. Sleep changes first. Not the amount, the quality. Some inmates sleep too much. Others barely sleep at all. Dreams become vivid, then intrusive. Thoughts repeat themselves. Memory fragments surface without warning. The brain, starved of stimulation, begins turning inward. By the end of the first month, inmates report something they cannot easily explain. The sense that their internal voice has grown louder. Thoughts echo. Silence feels heavy. Concentration becomes difficult. Emotions flatten, not from peace, but from overload. This is the phase most people misunderstand. There is no screaming, no dramatic collapse, just adaptation, the kind that costs something. By day 45, routine becomes survival. Wake, count, wait, eat, wait again. Some men begin speaking to themselves, not out of madness, but out of necessity. Others stop speaking entirely, conserving words like a resource that might run out. The cell becomes both shelter and pressure chamber. And then comes the hardest realization of all. This is not temporary. ADX Florence does not rely on fear. It relies on permanence. By the second month, inmates stop measuring time in days. They measure it in sensations, or the lack of them. A change in light, a distant sound, the rare moment of movement beyond the door. The mind adapts by narrowing. Focus shrinks. The outside world feels unreal. Family memories feel distant. Faces blur. Voices fade. And still, there is no violence. No chaos. No disorder. Which is exactly the point. By the time day 90 arrives, something has shifted. Not everyone breaks. But no one remains unchanged. Some inmates emerge hyper-controlled, rigid, withdrawn, emotionally guarded. Others show signs of psychological compression, heightened anxiety, paranoia, or emotional numbness. The system does not announce this change. It simply observes it, because the first 90 days inside ADX Florence are not about punishment in the traditional sense. They are about conditioning. This is where inmates learn the rules of silence, the rhythm of isolation, the cost of thinking too much or too little. And this is only the beginning, because if 90 days can do this, what does years inside ADX Florence do to a human being? That is what this documentary reveals. Before we begin, tap like, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us uncover the darkest corners of the prison system. Now let's step inside. Arrival and sensory shock. The first thing inmates notice when they arrive at ADX Florence is not what they see, but what they don't hear. There are no raised voices, no overlapping sounds of movement, no metallic clatter echoing through crowded tiers. The facility greets new arrivals with an almost unsettling stillness. This silence is not accidental. It is engineered, reinforced by thick concrete, sealed doors, and architectural choices designed to absorb noise rather than amplify it. From the moment the transport vehicle stops, the inmate is entering an environment where sensory input is deliberately limited. Arrival at ADX Florence is procedural and precise. Inmates are removed from transport under strict control, often without seeing another prisoner. Movements are choreographed, timed, and monitored. Orders are brief and emotionless. There is no shouting because shouting is unnecessary. Compliance is assumed, not negotiated. Even at intake, the process feels less like a transition and more like a transfer into a controlled system already operating at full capacity. The intake process strips away the last remaining markers of individuality. Personal property is cataloged and removed. Clothing is exchanged for standard issue attire. The inmate is informed of the rules, but not in a way that invites understanding. The rules are stated as facts, not guidelines. They are not explained in detail because explanation implies discussion. At ADX Florence, discussion is minimal. The message is clear. The system functions regardless of whether the inmate fully comprehends it. When the cell door finally opens, the space inside appears deceptively ordinary. The cell is not dramatically small, nor is it overtly hostile in appearance. It contains a bed, a desk, a toilet, and a sink, all fixed in place. The walls are solid concrete. The window, if present, is narrow and positioned to admit light without offering a view of the outside world. Every element serves a purpose, and none of them are optional. The door closes without ceremony. It does not slam. It seals. The sound is muted, final, and unmistakable. With that sound, the inmate enters a state of near total isolation that will define the next 90 days and likely far longer. During the first 24 hours, most inmates remain alert. Adrenaline carries them forward. The mind stays busy cataloging details, the texture of the walls, the rhythm of footsteps in the corridor, the timing of meals. This initial hyperawareness is a natural response to uncertainty. The brain searches for patterns, hoping to predict what comes next. At ADX Florence, those patterns are intentionally limited. Meals arrive through a slot in the door. There is no conversation, no eye contact. The exchange is efficient and brief. Once the tray is inside, the slot closes, restoring silence. Even this small interaction reinforces a critical lesson. Human contact exists, but it is controlled and distant. The lighting inside the cell is constant. There is no dramatic shift from day to night. Time must be inferred rather than observed. Without visual cues from the outside world, the inmate begins relying on routine to understand the passage of hours. This reliance develops quickly because there are few alternatives. By the second day, the absence of sound becomes more noticeable. In other prisons, noise is unavoidable. Here it is rare. The lack of auditory stimulation can feel calming at first, but that sensation does not last. Silence is weight. It presses inward, filling the space left by conversation, movement, and unpredictability. Sleep during the first week is inconsistent. Some inmates sleep excessively, using rest as an escape from monotony. Others struggle to sleep at all. The unfamiliar environment, combined with constant lighting and heightened awareness, disrupts natural rhythms. Dreams, when they occur, are often vivid and intrusive. The mind, deprived of external input, begins generating its own stimulation. By day 3 or 4, the realization sets in that this environment is not temporary. There is no orientation period followed by integration into a broader population. This cell is the population. The routine does not change, and there is no indication that it will. The psychological impact of this realization is subtle but significant. Hope narrows. Expectations adjust downward. Inmates begin pacing, counting steps from wall to wall, memorizing the dimensions of the cell. These behaviors are not signs of panic. They are attempts to impose structure on a space designed to resist it. The mind seeks control wherever it can find it, even if that control is limited to counting footsteps or tracking the timing of meals. By the end of the first week, emotional responses begin to flatten. Fear does not disappear, but it becomes less sharp, more diffuse. Anxiety settles into a constant background presence. Without variation, intense emotions are difficult to sustain. The system does not rely on fear alone. It relies on predictability. The absence of other inmates is one of the most jarring aspects of this initial period. Voices may occasionally be heard through walls, but they are distant and indistinct. There is no shared experience, no visible reminder that others are enduring the same conditions. Isolation becomes not just physical, but psychological. Correctional staff interactions remain minimal and professional. There is no hostility, but there is no warmth. Instructions are given, tasks are completed, and communication ends. This neutrality reinforces the sense that the system is indifferent to individual experience. It does not react. It does not respond. It simply continues. By day 7, most inmates understand that resistance is futile in the traditional sense. There is nothing to push against, no crowd to blend into, no noise to hide behind. The environment absorbs energy without reflecting it back. This realization marks the end of the initial shock phase and the beginning of adaptation. The first week inside ADX Florence does not break inmates. It introduces them to a reality where breaking is unnecessary. The environment does not need to overpower the individual. It only needs to remain unchanged. Silence, routine, and isolation do the rest. This is how the process begins. Quietly, methodically, without drama. The first 7 days set the tone for everything that follows, teaching inmates a fundamental lesson they will carry with them long after the initial shock fades. Inside ADX Florence, control is not asserted through force, but through absence. The routine that replaces reality, days 8 to 30. By the second week inside ADX Florence, the shock of arrival has faded, but nothing has replaced it. There is no sense of adjustment in the traditional meaning of the word. Instead, there is repetition. The days no longer feel new, yet they do not feel familiar either. They simply repeat, each one closely resembling the last, forming a continuous loop that is difficult to interrupt or escape. Routine becomes the central organizing force of life inside the cell. Wake-up times are consistent, though the inmate may not always know the exact hour. Meals arrive on schedule, delivered through the same slot, by the same process, without variation. Cleaning tasks, brief periods of permitted movement, and prescribed activities occur according to strict timing. Nothing is spontaneous. Nothing is negotiable. This routine does not exist to provide comfort. It exists to remove uncertainty. In doing so, it gradually replaces the outside world as the primary reference point for reality. News of current events is limited. Social interaction is nearly non-existent. Over time, the inmate's sense of relevance to anything beyond the cell begins to fade. During these days, the mind starts to notice the absence of meaningful choice. Decisions that once defined daily life no longer exist. There is no deciding when to eat, when to sleep, or when to interact with others. Even small personal preferences are constrained. The system decides first, and the individual follows. At first, this loss of choice can feel relieving. Responsibility shrinks. The pressure to plan disappears. But this relief is temporary. As days accumulate, the absence of autonomy begins to register as something deeper than inconvenience. It becomes a quiet form of erosion. Exercise, when permitted, occurs in controlled environments that mirror the cell itself. There are no shared spaces, no casual interactions. Movement is allowed, but always alone. Physical activity becomes another structured task rather than an outlet. The body moves, but the mind remains enclosed. By the third week, time perception begins to distort more noticeably. Without external markers like changing weather, crowds, or varied environments, the days blur together. Inmates often struggle to recall whether a specific event happened yesterday or several days earlier. Memory becomes less anchored. The routine is so consistent that individual moments lose distinction. This blurring has psychological consequences. The brain relies on novelty and variation to encode memories. When those elements disappear, the sense of continuity weakens. Days feel shorter in hindsight, yet longer while being lived. Hours stretch, but weeks vanish when looking back. Thought patterns also change during this phase. Conversations that once occurred externally now happen internally. Inmates replay past events, arguments, and decisions, often without resolution. The same thoughts return repeatedly, looping without interruption. There are no distractions strong enough to break the cycle. Some inmates attempt to impose their own routines within the larger system. They assign specific times to pacing, exercising, reading, or writing. These self-imposed structures are survival strategies. They offer a sense of control in an environment designed to limit it. For some, this helps maintain mental stability. For others, it becomes another source of pressure when even self-created goals feel impossible to sustain. Sleep continues to fluctuate. The consistency of the environment does not translate into restful rest. Without clear day-night cues, circadian rhythms drift. Some inmates report sleeping in short bursts rather than long stretches. Others experience insomnia, lying awake with nothing but their thoughts and the low hum of the facility. Emotional responses become more muted during this period. The intensity of fear from the first week subsides, but it is not replaced by calm. Instead, there is a flattening of emotion. Joy is rare. Anger lacks an outlet. Sadness becomes less sharp but more persistent. The emotional landscape narrows. Human contact remains minimal and functional. Staff interactions are brief and procedural. There is no casual conversation, no opportunity for rapport. This neutrality reinforces the feeling that individuality is irrelevant. The system interacts with roles, not people. By the end of the second week, inmates begin to internalize the rules without conscious effort. Compliance becomes automatic. Movements are executed without thought. Instructions are followed without resistance. This is not the result of fear alone, but of conditioning. The environment rewards predictability and discourages deviation. Around day 20, many inmates experience a subtle but important shift. The outside world starts to feel abstract. Memories of family, friends, and past environments lose immediacy. They still exist, but they no longer feel close. The present reality of the cell dominates mental space. This is often when inmates realize that the routine has replaced reality. The schedule dictates not just actions, but thoughts. The rhythm of the institution becomes the rhythm of the mind. When the routine pauses, there is nothing to fill the space. Some inmates attempt to resist this mental shift by focusing intensely on memories or future plans. Others retreat inward, limiting thought to the present moment as a form of self-protection. Neither approach is inherently right or wrong. Both reflect attempts to survive prolonged isolation. By day 30, the routine no longer feels imposed. It feels inevitable. The inmate may not like it, but it is no longer surprising. The predictability that once felt oppressive now feels unavoidable. Change, even if it were offered, would require adjustment that feels exhausting. This stage is not marked by dramatic breakdowns or visible crises. It is marked by quiet acceptance. The system does not need to force compliance. The routine does that on its own. The second phase of the first 90 days teaches a critical lesson. Reality inside ADX Florence is not shaped by events, but by repetition. When every day looks the same, the mind adapts by shrinking its expectations. The world becomes smaller, more contained, and easier to manage. But this adaptation comes at cost. By the end of the first month, inmates are no longer measuring time by calendars or dates. They measure it by meals, by lights, by the rare moments of movement. The routine has become the framework through which all experience is filtered. This is not yet psychological collapse. It is preparation. The system has established control, not through force or chaos, but through consistency. What comes next will depend on how the mind responds when there is nowhere left to escape except inward. When a mind turns inward, days 31 to 60. By the time an inmate reaches the second month inside ADX Florence, the environment no longer feels unfamiliar. The routines are known. The rules are internalized. The silence is expected. What changes during this period is not the structure of daily life, but the direction of attention. With the outside world effectively removed, the mind turns inward. This shift does not happen suddenly. It unfolds gradually, often without the inmate fully realizing it. At first, thoughts simply linger longer than they used to. Ideas repeat themselves. Memories surface more frequently. Over time, this inward focus becomes dominant, filling the mental space once occupied by external stimulation. Without meaningful interaction, the brain begins to rely on itself for engagement. Thoughts become conversations. Memories become events. The past and the present start to blur as the mind revisits moments with unusual intensity. Some inmates replay conversations they had years earlier, dissecting every word. Others fixate on decisions that led them to ADX Florence, imagining alternative outcomes that can never occur. This mental looping is one of the defining features of this phase. In a typical environment, repetition is interrupted by new experiences. Inside ADX Florence, there are few interruptions. The same thoughts return again and again, gaining strength through repetition. The mind, deprived of novelty, amplifies whatever content is available. Sleep patterns often deteriorate further during this period. Dreams become more vivid and emotionally charged. Some inmates report dreaming of open spaces, crowds, or familiar places, only to wake abruptly to concrete walls and silence. This contrast can be disorienting. The boundary between dream and waking life feels thinner, less stable. Others experience intrusive thoughts while awake. Images and memories appear without warning, sometimes triggered by nothing at all. These thoughts are not necessarily violent or disturbing, but their persistence can be exhausting. The inability to redirect attention makes them feel overwhelming. Time perception continues to distort. Days pass slowly while being lived, yet weeks disappear when reflected upon. Without clear markers to separate one day from the next, the mind struggles to form a coherent timeline. Events lose sequence. The concept of recent becomes vague. During this phase, some inmates begin speaking aloud to themselves. This behavior is often misunderstood as a sign of instability. In reality, it can be a coping mechanism. Verbalizing thoughts provides structure and relief in an environment where silence dominates. Hearing one's own voice becomes a way to confirm existence. Others do the opposite, withdrawing further into silence. Words feel unnecessary, even wasteful. Communication becomes internal, contained. For these inmates, conserving mental energy becomes a priority. Thinking less feels safer than thinking too much. Emotional responses grow more complex during this stage. The emotional flattening of the previous phase may deepen, but it is often accompanied by sudden spikes of feeling. Anxiety can appear without a clear cause. Irritation may flare in response to minor disruptions. These fluctuations reflect the strain of prolonged isolation on emotional regulation. Paranoia can also emerge, though it is usually subtle. Inmates may become hyper-aware of sounds, interpreting ordinary noises as significant. A distant door, closing, or a muffled voice can prompt speculation. With limited information, the mind fills gaps, sometimes inaccurately. Memory changes are another notable feature of this period. Some inmates report difficulty recalling recent events, while older memories remain sharp. Others experience the opposite, struggling to access long-term memories while fixating on recent routines. These shifts are linked to the brain's reliance on stimulation to organize and prioritize information. Reading, writing, or other permitted activities can offer temporary relief, but they do not fully counteract the inward pull. When the activity ends, the mind returns to itself. Distraction is brief. Introspection is constant. By the middle of this phase, many inmates recognize that their thoughts feel louder than they once did. Silence no longer feels empty. It feels crowded. The absence of external input forces internal processes to the forefront. There is no escape from one's own mind. Some inmates attempt to manage this by setting mental boundaries. They limit the topics they allow themselves to think about. Others create internal routines, scheduling times for reflection and times for mental rest. These strategies can help, but they require sustained effort in an environment that offers little reinforcement. The lack of feedback from others also affects self-perception. Without interaction, it becomes harder to gauge how one is changing. Inmates may question whether their reactions are normal or exaggerated. There is no social reference point. Identity begins to feel less defined. This uncertainty can be unsettling. The sense of self, usually reinforced through interaction, becomes unstable. Some inmates cling tightly to past identities, replaying roles they once held. Others allow those identities to fade, focusing instead on immediate survival. By day 60, the inward turn of the mind is well established. Thoughts are no longer just reactions. They're the primary experience. The cell has become a mental environment as much as a physical one. What happens inside the head matters more than what happens outside the door. This stage is critical because it sets the foundation for what comes next. The mind has adapted to isolation by intensifying internal processes. Whether this leads to stability or erosion depends on factors that are often invisible from the outside. The system does not intervene during this phase. There are no alarms or thresholds that trigger change. The environment remains constant, allowing the psychological process to unfold without interruption. By the end of the second month, inmates have learned a difficult truth. In a place where almost everything is controlled, the mind becomes both refuge and risk. It can protect, but it can also amplify distress. Managing one's own thoughts becomes the central challenge of daily life. This is not yet collapse. It is consolidation. The inward turn has taken hold, shaping perception, emotion, and identity. What follows will determine whether this adaptation hardens into control or begins to fracture under pressure. Adaptation or erosion, days 61 to 90. By the third month inside ADX Florence, the question is no longer whether an inmate can endure isolation. Endurance has already been proven. The question now becomes what that endurance is costing. The environment has not changed, but the individual has. The mind has adapted to the absence of stimulation, and that adaptation begins to solidify into something more permanent. This phase is defined by a fork in the psychological road. Some inmates develop rigid, coping structures that allow them to function within the narrow confines of the system. Others begin to show signs of erosion, where the effort required to maintain stability becomes unsustainable. Both outcomes are responses to the same conditions. For those who adapt, control becomes the central theme. Thoughts are regulated carefully. Emotions are contained, sometimes deliberately suppressed. The inmate learns which memories to avoid and which routines provide the greatest sense of stability. This self-discipline can appear calm from the outside, but it often requires constant vigilance. Letting the mind wander feels risky. These inmates may develop highly structured internal schedules. Specific times are assigned for exercise, reading, reflection, and rest. Deviating from these self-imposed routines can trigger anxiety, reinforcing their importance. Structure becomes a shield against chaos, even when that chaos is entirely internal. Others experience a different trajectory. Instead of tightening control, their mental boundaries begin to weaken. Concentration becomes difficult. Small disruptions feel overwhelming. Emotional responses become unpredictable. The strategies that once provided relief no longer work as effectively. This erosion is not dramatic. It does not resemble the sudden breakdowns often depicted in popular narratives about isolation. It is gradual and quiet. Motivation declines. Mental energy diminishes. The effort required to maintain focus increases, while the rewards for that effort remain minimal. Emotional numbness often deepens during this stage. Feelings do not disappear, but they lose clarity. Joy, anger, and sadness blend into a muted background state. This flattening can feel protective at first, reducing distress. Over time, it can also reduce the sense of being alive. Anxiety remains present, though it may change form. Instead of acute fear, it becomes a low-level tension that never fully resolves. Some inmates describe a constant sense of anticipation without a clear object. The body stays alert even when there is nothing to respond to. Sleep disturbances persist and, for some, worsen. The mind struggles to disengage from itself. Rest becomes shallow. Fatigue accumulates. Without restorative sleep, cognitive functions such as memory, attention, and emotional regulation become harder to sustain. During this period, interactions with staff continue to be minimal and procedural. There is no adjustment to the inmate's psychological state because the system is not designed to respond to individual change. Stability is measured by compliance, not by well-being. The absence of feedback reinforces isolation. Inmates rarely know whether their coping strategies are effective or harmful. There is no external validation, no reassurance, no correction. The mind operates without reference, relying solely on internal signals. For some, this leads to hyperawareness. Every sound, every minor change in routine, every perceived irregularity becomes significant. The mind searches for meaning in small details, sometimes assigning importance where none exists. This heightened vigilance can be exhausting. Others experience the opposite, a narrowing of attention. Awareness shrinks to immediate tasks. Long-term thinking feels pointless. The future becomes abstract. Survival is measured day by day, sometimes moment by moment. Identity continues to shift during this phase. The roles and labels that once defined the individual lose relevance. The inmate becomes defined primarily by their relationship to the environment. Inmate is no longer a temporary status. It feels like a complete description. This identity compression can feel stabilizing in the short term. Fewer identities mean fewer conflicts, but it also reduces resilience. When identity is narrow, there is little buffer against psychological stress. By day 90, the cumulative effects of isolation, routine, and inward focus are evident. Even inmates who appear composed have changed. Their emotional range is different. Their thought patterns are altered. Their perception of time, self, and reality has shifted. Importantly, this change is not uniform. ADX Florence does not produce a single psychological outcome. It creates conditions that force adaptation, and those adaptations vary. What they share is permanence. Once established, these patterns do not disappear quickly. The system does not intervene at this stage because it does not need to. The environment has achieved its objective, predictability. Whether through control or erosion, the inmate has adjusted to the rules of isolation. This adjustment is often mistaken for resilience. From an administrative perspective, the absence of overt distress suggests success. But beneath the surface, the cost of adaptation continues to accumulate. By the end of the first 90 days, inmates have crossed a threshold. The initial shock is gone. The routine is internalized. The mind has reorganized itself around the constraints of the environment. What remains is not simply survival, but transformation. The first 3 months inside ADX Florence do not determine an inmate's fate, but they set the parameters within which all future experience will occur. The choices made during this period, whether to tighten control or endure erosion, shape how the individual will exist inside the system going forward. This is the point where change becomes difficult to reverse. The environment no longer feels imposed from the outside. It feels normal, and that normalization is the most powerful effect of all. Why the system is designed this way. By the time an inmate reaches the end of the first 90 days inside ADX Florence, the most important question is no longer how they are coping, but why the system is structured to produce this outcome. ADX Florence was not built by accident, nor did its operating philosophy evolve casually over time. Every aspect of the institution reflects deliberate choices rooted in control, risk management, and institutional priorities. ADX Florence exists to house inmates the federal system has deemed exceptionally dangerous, disruptive, or unmanageable in other facilities. These are individuals considered capable of influencing others, organizing violence, or continuing criminal activity even while incarcerated. From an administrative perspective, traditional prison environments present too many variables. Contact between inmates creates unpredictability. Noise, movement, and informal communication create opportunities for coordination and resistance. The solution adopted at ADX Florence is isolation as infrastructure. Instead of reacting to behavior, the system preemptively limits the conditions under which behavior can occur. By separating inmates almost entirely from one another, the institution reduces the risk of collective action. Violence becomes harder to organize. Influence becomes difficult to exert. Control shifts from active enforcement to environmental design. This approach prioritizes predictability above all else. In a system responsible for individuals labeled as high risk, predictability is viewed as safety. A predictable inmate is easier to manage. A predictable environment is easier to secure. From this perspective, the psychological effects of isolation are secondary concerns. The architecture of ADX Florence reflects this philosophy. Thick concrete walls limit sound transmission. Cells are designed to function as self-contained units. Movement pathways are separated to prevent interaction. Even light and airflow are regulated to reduce sensory variability. The building itself enforces the rules without requiring constant human intervention. Routine reinforces this architectural control. By maintaining strict schedules and standardized procedures, the institution minimizes uncertainty. Staff do not need to negotiate or adapt to individual preferences. Consistency becomes a form of authority. The system functions the same way every day, regardless of who occupies the cell. From an operational standpoint, this model is efficient. Fewer interactions reduce the likelihood of confrontation. Limited movement simplifies logistics. Isolation reduces the need for large-scale security responses. The institution can operate with fewer unpredictable incidents, which is often interpreted as success. However, this efficiency comes with trade-offs. The same mechanisms that reduce risk also reduce human connection. By treating isolation as a default condition rather than a temporary measure, the system shifts the burden of adaptation entirely onto the inmate. Psychological strain becomes an accepted byproduct rather than a problem to be solved. Supporters of the model argue that ADX Florence serves a necessary function within the broader correctional system. They point to the individuals housed there and the risks they are believed to pose. From this view, extreme measures are justified by extreme cases. Safety, both inside and outside the institution, is presented as the primary goal. Critics counter that prolonged isolation creates long-term psychological harm that can undermine that very goal. Inmates who adapt to extreme isolation may struggle to function in less restrictive environments. Emotional flattening, hypervigilance, and impaired social skills do not disappear when isolation ends. Instead, they often persist, complicating any future reintegration. The system itself does not directly address this tension. ADX Florence is not designed to rehabilitate in the traditional sense. Its purpose is containment. Behavioral change is not actively cultivated. It is expected to emerge indirectly through control and deprivation. Compliance is the metric, not psychological health. This distinction matters because it shapes every decision made within the institution. Programs, interactions, and privileges are limited not because they are ineffective, but because they introduce variability. Variability is viewed as risk. Stability, even if psychologically costly, is preferred. The first 90 days play a critical role in establishing this framework. During this period, inmates learn the rules not just intellectually, but experientially. They learn that resistance is futile not because of punishment, but because the environment absorbs it. They learn that adaptation is necessary, even if it requires internal compromise. Once this lesson is internalized, the system can maintain control with minimal effort. The inmate regulates themselves. Routine becomes internal. Silence becomes normal. The institution no longer needs to impose authority actively. It has already been accepted. This self-regulation is central to why the model persists. From an administrative perspective, an inmate who complies quietly is a success. The absence of visible distress is interpreted as stability. What happens internally is difficult to measure and, therefore, easier to overlook. The design also creates distance between staff and inmates. By limiting interaction, the system reduces emotional entanglement. Decisions are procedural rather than personal. This detachment can protect staff from burnout, but it also reduces opportunities for empathy and intervention. ADX Florence does not exist in isolation from broader correctional trends. It reflects a wider emphasis on security, risk management, and liability reduction. In systems where failure can have severe consequences, conservative design choices dominate. Isolation becomes a safeguard. Yet the long-term implications of this approach remain contested. Research on prolonged isolation suggests lasting psychological effects that do not resolve quickly. When inmates eventually leave ADX Florence, whether through transfer or release, the adaptations that once ensured survival can become liabilities. The system does not provide a clear off-ramp from isolation. Transition processes are slow and limited. The psychological adjustments made during the first 90 days are reinforced over time, becoming more ingrained rather than softened. Understanding why ADX Florence is designed this way requires acknowledging its priorities. It is a facility built to prevent worst-case scenarios, even if doing so creates invisible costs. The first 90 days reveal how those priorities shape human experience at the most fundamental level. The institution does not ask whether the mind can endure isolation. It assumes it must. And in that assumption lies the defining tension of ADX Florence, a system optimized for control, operating in a space where the human capacity to adapt is both its greatest asset and its greatest vulnerability. After 90 days, there is no reset. By the time the first 90 days inside ADX Florence come to an end, the most important change is not visible on paper or in institutional records. It happens quietly, internally, and often without acknowledgement. The inmate who entered the facility is no longer the same person who now occupies the cell, not because of a single traumatic event, but because of sustained exposure to an environment designed to reshape how the mind functions. There is no ceremony marking the end of those 90 days. No signal that a milestone has been reached. The routine continues unchanged. Meals arrive the same way. Doors open and close on the same schedule. Silence remains intact. From a systems perspective, nothing significant has happened. But for the individual inside the cell, something fundamental has shifted. The adaptations formed during this period do not simply disappear. Emotional flattening, hypercontrol, inward focus, and altered time perception become part of how the mind operates. These changes are not temporary reactions. They're coping mechanisms reinforced by repetition. The longer they persist, the harder they are to undo. This is why the first 90 days matter so much. They establish the baseline. They teach the inmate what is required to function in this environment. Once those lessons are learned, the mind reorganizes itself accordingly. Silence is no longer shocking. Isolation becomes normal. The absence of human contact feels expected rather than alarming. From the outside, this can look like resilience. The inmate follows rules, avoids incidents, and maintains order. Administratively, this is success. The system has achieved predictability. The environment is stable. Risk appears minimized. But predictability does not equal health. The cost of adaptation often remains hidden until circumstances change. When inmates are transferred out of ADX Florence or released from isolation, the skills that once ensured survival can become obstacles. Emotional restraint can look like detachment. Hypervigilance can become anxiety. Inward focus can turn into withdrawal. Reintegration, whether into a less restrictive prison or into society, requires flexibility, social awareness, and emotional responsiveness. These are precisely the capacities that prolonged isolation suppresses. The mind does not switch modes easily. There is no reset button that restores previous functioning. Former inmates have described feeling out of sync with the world after leaving isolation. Noise feels overwhelming. Crowds trigger stress. Conversations feel exhausting. The internal control developed inside ADX Florence does not dissolve simply because the environment has changed. This raises difficult questions about the long-term purpose of extreme isolation. If the goal is containment, ADX Florence succeeds. If the goal is rehabilitation, the outcome is far less clear. The system prioritizes security in the present, often at the expense of future adjustment. The first 90 days reveal how this trade-off is embedded into the design. The institution does not rely on punishment in the traditional sense. It relies on endurance. It assumes the human mind will adapt. It builds an environment that makes adaptation unavoidable. What those 90 days demonstrate is not weakness, but capacity. The human mind is remarkably flexible. It can reorganize itself to survive even the most restrictive conditions. But flexibility has consequences. Every adaptation is a compromise. Every coping strategy reshapes perception, emotion, and identity. ADX Florence does not ask what those compromises will cost over time. It does not need to. Its mandate is narrow and its priorities are clear. Safety, control, and predictability come first. Everything else is secondary. Understanding this reality does not require sympathy or condemnation. It requires clarity. The first 90 days are not an anomaly. They are the foundation. They show how an environment, when left unchanged, can change the people inside it without force, noise, or visible conflict. For the inmates who pass through ADX Florence, those early months often define their experience long after the calendar moves on. The system teaches them how to exist within silence, how to manage isolation, and how to survive with minimal connection. Those lessons linger. And for those on the outside, the story of the first 90 days offers a rare glimpse into how modern correctional systems exert control not just over bodies, but over minds. It shows how design, routine, and absence can be as powerful as walls and locks. There is no dramatic ending to this story. No final confrontation. No clear resolution. The effects of the first 90 days continue quietly, unfolding over years rather than moments. Because inside ADX Florence, time does not heal. It conditions. And once that conditioning takes hold, there is no simple way back to who someone was before the door first sealed shut. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe.